Okay, now we're. Okay, now we're. Now we're good. Perfect. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Давай, 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 давай.
Wolf Slayer 9.
Nope. All good on this front. Hearts about in 4. Good. Okay, so everything is actually set up here for proper shenanigans stream. Okay. I got all the good, wonderful things here. Set up. There we go. All right, how are you doing, man? I got everything set up now. All is good. Like, check out this world that I've found myself in. So obviously, I'm playing as Russian Empire, you know, just being casual. Working on some industrial modernization that's heavily needed. Although it's kind of late because I believe my industry is already modernized. The focus tree, like I completely messed all this up. I don't even have a fucking spy network. I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah, I should work on some passive defense. And obviously, the main kicker being the UK is in the Falklands, where the UK belongs for now. Italian, East Africa. But yeah, here's a behemoth I'm up against. I don't know what to do about this. Like, now of course you got the atomic bombing of Mexico City, blah blah blah. What are the Philippines are a a United States puppet. I see. So for now, I think what I'm gonna do is watch a few videos for the memes. Yeah. You know. Mhm. Video. Oh, this thing. You know what I would like to do is play Black Myth Wukong, but I don't seem to have any way of doing that at the moment, sadly. No, I don't want to. Ooh. This looks fun.
Host Whip Union, and in this one we Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Konstantinivka, where the Russians have managed to push towards the main road going through the center of the town. The Russians now control the southern bank of the river line in the eastern parts of Konstantinivka, as they continue fighting in the direction of the central parts near the educational facilities to gain access to the crossing that moves through the northern and southern parts of Konstantinivka between the Dacia area and fortified positions to the north towards the town itself in the south. The Russians have continued positional fighting within the town since they first got their foothold at the end of last month, and in this month they have slowly pushed through to the central parts. We see at the same time in the northern parts, the Russians have yet to gain a foothold in the Dacia area of fortified positions. They have not really been launching any offensive operations following the capture of Paraskovivka. Instead, we have seen some positional fighting last month south of Pobieda. This could indicate that the Russians are waiting for the crossing to be under their control before they launch offensive operations towards the northern parts, both the fortified positions from Pobieda and the Dacia area from Paraskovivka. So we see that the positional fighting is likely to expand to the northern parts of the town once the Russians have gained control over the central parts of
We need the
Russia.
Dacha area.
Further north, in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the northern parts of Garylivka, west of Yastrobodivka, where the front line is now exchanged by the crossing over the Karlovska Reservoir. So we see that the Russians have positions a foothold in the Dacha of Garylivka in the southern parts of the reservoir, and at the same time they've now pushed to the bridge here in the central parts, and in the northern parts the Russians have full control over the riverbank by the Vovcha River. So we see that the
Nice.
Russians now are fighting against the Ukrainians in two positions here to the east, both by the crossing of the Karolivka Reservoir and within Karolivka itself. At the same time, with the recent Russian advances, they are now pressuring the Ukrainian positions by Komishivka and Petishche, where they're moving down in a southern direction towards the flank of Karolivka, where offensive operations will likely continue down south along the river line, where the Ukrainians are pushed up against a wall. In the direction of Selidove, the Russians have managed to gain control over some fortified positions just outside the Terikon Heights, as well as just outside Marinivka, where heavy fighting continues along the E50 highway, which is connected between Pokrovsk and down south towards Karolivka. We at the same time see that the Russians are now contesting the Terikon after a foothold gained within the industrial area of it. The sequence of events points towards the Russians gaining control of it, after which the Ukrainians launched a counterattack, and that is what is currently ongoing, where the Ukrainians are trying to reestablish control over it, and that is left in the gray zone, where neither side has control of it, but the Russians are attempting to gain full control of it, as the advantage gained by having it under their control would be a strong foothold to completely stop the E50 highway and any connection directly between Selidove and Karolivka, which would leave the Ukrainians in a position where they have to go a massive way around to reach Karolivka, and it would significantly strengthen the Russian positions to move further down south along the fortified areas, down to Ukrainsk, down at the bottom of the fortified positions going in a southern direction, and through Membrik, which would cut off the majority of supplies here in the southeastern parts, and be part of an operation of the Russians to completely cut off the Ukrainian positions to the east, all the way from Karolivka in the north to Ostrivsk in the south and Hustre. The Russians will likely launch an operation from Maximilianivka to gain full control of it, and then push in a northern direction to cut off the connection between Korohove and this line of towns, which are under Ukrainian control, as a defensive line west of Krasnoyarivka. And the Russians will at the same time push down south along the fortified positions to gain control over the heights and fortified positions west of this village chain, all the way down south towards the Korohove and Vovcha River in the south, which would lead to the Russians completely cutting off the Ukrainian positions here in between the two sides. This will lead to an encirclement of a large portion of Ukrainian forces. Further north in the direction of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to gain control over the Terikon here, the complete control over the second line of defense, and now they are moving towards the residential area and the forested areas within Toretsk itself, where operations will start moving in a northern direction for the Russians to gain a foothold several areas within the city. They're likely going to move through the Dacha area, forest areas, and Pivnishne, where the goal is to gain a foothold in the apartment complex area and move towards the central parts to start street fighting within the city. The city of Toretsk still remains fully under Ukrainian control, however, with the loss of the first and second lines of defense, as well as the 2014 line of defense to the south, combined with New York, the situation in Toretsk has degraded significantly in favor of the Russians, and this has created many problems for the Ukrainians, and this will manifest themselves in the Russian operations in the coming days and weeks. In the north, by Vyemka, the Russians have managed to advance a small bit further towards the few houses village, where the Ukrainians have possessions here to the south. The Russians previously captured Ivano-Darivka, but due to the Ukrainians still having control over the heights with fortified positions, control could not be held. Therefore, the Russians withdrew to avoid casualties until they launched operations through the heights to gain control over the fortified positions. They are now expanding the front line to the south by moving the direction of Vyemka along the railways going through from hidden in Belorivka to the south towards Viemka, and they are now very close towards the village, but it will not significantly change the situation as there's still this river line here to the south of the fortified positions, and the Ukrainians still have the advantage of the high ground on the other bank of the river. Therefore, the Russians are in no position to simply just drive through towards Siversk, but instead this will be a further development in favor of improving the positions of the Russians ahead of an offensive coming from the east, where their height elevation is equal rather than the Ukrainians having an advantage. The objective would be for the Russians to move along the river line from the south and combine that with an assault from the east, which will negate the Ukrainian height advantage, and the Russians will pincer the Ukrainian forces from two directions, and this will force the Ukrainians to then withdraw from their position towards Siversk itself, where fighting would then take place. The Ukrainians still have strong positions by Verkhnokamensk in the center and their positions in the north on the heights as well. This will lead to the Russians having a difficult time in the section of the front line until they launch a general offensive, similar to the following the control of Lysychansk in the summer of 2022. Moving on to the Kharkiv section of the front line, the Russians are slowly moving from Hlyboki towards Lipsy yet again, following the Ukrainian withdrawal and relocation of troops from the Kharkiv section towards the Kursk section of the front line. The Ukrainian defenses here have weakened and the pressure on the Russian forces have weakened, and this has led to the Russians regaining the initiative, regaining full control of Hlyboki, and starting offensive operations towards the Dacha area yet again. We're seeing that the Russians have restarted positional fighting in the Hlyboki-Lipsy section of the Kharkiv front line. In the Kursk section of the front line, we see that the Ukrainians have managed to advance in 3 separate directions and captured 3 separate villages. In the western parts, the Ukrainians now have control over the entire road from Gorodivka here in the south all the way to Snagost and Vishnivka to the north. The objective of the Ukrainians here is to launch a general offensive from not the border area, because the Russians are prepared there with fortified positions, but from the flank to gain control over the land bridge, avoiding the river line here to the north between Koronevo and the Russian positions in the south, where they will continue offensive operations along the side of the fortified positions of the Russians towards gaining full control. So they'll likely also expand here from Tetkino and from the western flank to attack both flanks at the same time and push the Russians up against the river line in the north. This is the initial stages of an expanded Kursk offensive. But this raises the question, after Kursk incursion, what will Ukraine do next? And that is exactly the one I've answered, but the same question was asked by the Times. In it, they talk about how Zelensky claimed that this operation is to create a border buffer area in the Russian zone, but at the same time he also points it being towards negotiations. However, so far there's no evidence towards this being used for negotiations. Instead, the Ukrainians have established a military commandant's office in the occupied region, which leads to them clearly pointing towards expanding the front and expanding the operation rather than slowing down and holding what they are already hands on. Now the question is raised, is this worth it? Can they just continue doing this at a sustainable rate? And that is a very difficult question to answer because we do not really know the details. But it is clear that with the current situation, if the Ukrainians decide to pull out, it will be very difficult for them, because now the Russians have established a front line, which means that if the Ukrainians do attempt to withdraw, then the Russians will in this case heavily bombard their positions during their withdrawal. And this brings us to the second article by Forbes. David asks, he talks about how the Ukrainians are too vulnerable in the Kursk region. They're out in the open and on the move, and this just is a recipe for getting hit by Lancet drones, artillery, FAB bombs, and so on. And this causes the Ukrainian forces to lose lots of armored vehicles. He does argue that this could still be worth it, losing all of these armored vehicles, if it leads to something positive, like the Ukrainians holding
Doubt
on
it.
to this portion of the Kursk region to hold on for negotiations, which brings us to this third article by the New York Times. Ukraine says its incursion will bring peace. Putin's plans may differ. And pretty much what this article talks about is how the Russians are not pushing for negotiations anymore. On the contrary, they're pushing
shit.
for revenge. They say that hopes for peaceful settlements between Russia and Ukraine have completely collapsed after the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region, and now instead Putin and all of his political allies, as well as his political enemies in the Russian parliament, now all agree that this war should be fought and it should be won, because something like this is beyond what the Russians accept. It is another one of Putin's red lines. And this brings us to the final topic.
It wasn't Putin's red line, it was Russia's red line.
Putin's red lines.
That's what
Someone has constantly been saying
Putin was just voicing it.
pro-Russians, pro-Ukrainians, analysts.
It's like, what idiots actually thought
saying
that
Putin's
this was
red
going to be a good
lines
idea, the
are
Kursk bullshit.
practically
My
just
god.
an illusion. He sets them up, he draws them on the floor, Ukrainians pass through, the United States pass through, Europe passes
Like,
through.
you'd have to be a
and doesn't
complete
evaluate
idiot.
the consequences. And I beg to differ. I say that this is completely untrue. Every single time the West, Ukraine, whoever crosses a red line of Russia, Russia responds in one way or another. An example is the different military industrial complexes of European nations spontaneously combusting. That is sabotage, likely by Russian spies and so on. At the same time, the Russians recently, on August 6th, just before the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, sent S-400 systems as well as electronic warfare systems to Iran, as Iran prepares for their strike back at Israel for retaliation. This
Sabaki.
is also a significant development, as S-400 systems and electronic warfare systems cannot be operated by Iran yet. They still need training for these systems. This means that the Russians have not just sent them systems, but also operators to operate them and instructors to teach the Iranians to use these systems.
Oh,
The
which
Russians have not
systems?
sent S-400 systems as
Oh,
well as
S-400.
electronic warfare systems
Yeah.
to Iran, as Iran prepares for their strike back at Israel.
Yeah, there's
for
gonna be no
retaliation.
deals
This is
on...
also a significant
Russia's gonna send whatever the
development, as
fucking
S-400
weapons to
systems
whoever
and
the fuck
electronic warfare
Russia wants to
systems
send
cannot be
weapons to.
operated by
With
Iran
impunity
yet.
at this
They
point.
still need training for these
Who's gonna
systems.
tell
This
them
means
no?
that the Russians have not just sent them systems,
And like,
but
what are they
also
gonna do?
operators to
Threaten
operate them
economic
and
sanctions?
instructors to teach the Iranians to use these systems. And this is a significant escalation, because it means that if Israel and the United States end up at war with Iran, then they would have to face off against the S-400 system compared to previously just the S-300 systems. So this makes it more difficult for the United States and Israel. They have to replan, restructure their development plans and so on. And in the end, it is exactly the same as the West sending air defense to Ukraine. So this is how Russia responds. It responds on a larger geopolitical scene and not just in the context of the war in Ukraine. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe.
That was
and
nice.
check out
Nice video. Send that link. There we go. There's something else I wanted to watch.
1944. Hitler is speaking to his officers about the situation on the front. Suddenly the room is wrecked by explosion. Some people are thrown up out of the windows, one is killed on the spot, and many others
This
are
is a playlist called History from Start to Finish. Killing Hitler, brilliant plans to win World War II. Like, it's a bunch of animated stories. quite cool, actually.
seriously injured. Meanwhile, Klaus von Stauffenberg, the man who is responsible for the bombing, is hurrying to Berlin to take over the power from the Nazis. But Hitler is alive, and their plan is bound to failure. Stauffenberg could only use one bomb, and in the last moment it was moved so that part of the table shielded Hitler from the blast. The plot involved thousands of people, many of whom were high state officials, and took many months to prepare. And all those powerful men together were unable to kill the Führer. Yet only less than 5 years ago, one man almost succeeded where thousands had failed. Today we will tell his story. We'll have to go 10 years back in time. Nazis have come to power and they are beginning
Yeah,
to
oh,
steer
yes.
Germany towards war. Hitler is pursuing expansionist policies and one victory follows another.
Cheers,
Saarland is
everybody.
reunited with Germany and Austria and Sudetenland are annexed. Many Germans saw this as Germany's return to great power status and Hitler's popularity grew. However, one man saw the things otherwise. He saw the shadow of war. Where some saw the return of national glory and stability, he saw the descent toward another world war. And he came to a conclusion, the one that would have great impact on his life. He decided that if Europe is to avert another war, the men who were behind the aggressive policies had to be done away with. He decided that Hitler had to die, but who was this man? Meet Georg Elser. He is a craftsman, a rather skilled craftsman. However, for the job he has undertaken, he has no special skills. Yet he is dead serious about carrying it out. Where could one kill Hitler? Well, the best opportunity was probably in Munich around the 8th of November. Back in 1923, Hitler and the Nazi party attempted a coup in Munich. They seized the Bürgerbräukeller, but were later dispersed in street fighting. Hitler was imprisoned. After coming to power, Hitler commemorated the failed coup every year with a procession and a speech in the Bürgerbräukeller. On the 8th of November 1930,
These animations just make it look
Munich
awesome.
to look for an opportunity for the assassination. One possibility was to shoot Hitler from the crowd of onlookers. However, the abundance of Nazi salutes and flags made that difficult. Then Hitler would speak in the Bürgerbräukeller, but only veteran Nazis were allowed to enter. As shooting Hitler was complicated, Elsa decided that it would be better to blow Hitler up during his speech. It didn't make his task a lot easier. The Keller was basically a large pub that, for the most time, was open to all people. So one could be able to place a bomb there, but before Hitler's speech it would be searched. The bomb would have to be carefully concealed. How could you hide something as large as a timed bomb? Well, you put it in a wall or a pillar. If Elser could pull that off, then it would be days between placing the bomb and the explosion. That meant that Elser also needed an elaborate timer, one that could tick for days and go off with the precision of minutes. A task considered almost impossible with the technology of 1930s. These alone were difficult tasks, not to mention the problems with obtaining the explosives. In theory, Nazi Germany was a totalitarian state where people were tightly controlled and therefore could not be able to acquire the explosive materials, at least without alarming the
That's
Gestapo.
scary.
In practice, it was quite different. Military factories were crunching out arms on an unprecedented scale and were in need of workers. Elsa signed up to work in the shipping department of Waldenmeyer Armaments factory. He had to receive explosive materials and deliver them to other workers. There he got some knowledge about the explosives and could put aside 250 pellets of powder. Soon, Elsa had to leave that place. He didn't have enough explosives yet and he headed out to find some more. He went to a local quarry and began helping out the workers. When the owner questioned, "Was are you doing here?" he replied that, "Ich bin unemployed." Ja. Und bored und want to help. Ja. He was hired on the spot and began regularly working there. Now it was time to steal some more explosives. As it was Nazi Germany, the security was very... Wait, that wasn't so hard at all. He went to the shed where the explosives were stored and found out that it wasn't even properly locked. Elsa began paying visits to the shed at night and carrying away small amounts of explosives. Finally, he carried away a crate full of detonators. The security at the quarry was so lax, the owner was sent to a concentration camp after Elsa's assassination attempt was discovered. Now that he had the materials, it was time to design the bomb. Elser had no prior knowledge about bomb making, and at the time there was no internet where one could look that up. But as German army was expanding, it needed more pioneers, and therefore literature about explosives circulated freely. Elser bought a booklet, and it taught him a lot. He carried out a couple of test explosions in his family's garden shed. His uncle was working in the field. Suddenly there was a loud noise from the shed, and horses panicked. Elser later explained to his uncle that he was trying something out, and when he was done, his uncle would certainly hear about it. The detonator was ready, but it was
Cheers.
just the tip of the iceberg. The real difficulty was with with the timing mechanism. It had to be compact, be able to work for a long time, and be precise. A difficult challenge, yet one that Elsa managed to carry out with perfection. He had received some clock
Who was
parts
this
instead of
dude?
a salary in his earlier job, and now put him to good use. The basis of the mechanism was a clock. Every time the hour hand made a full circle, it moved the cogwheel for 1/12, so the timer could be set for 144 hours, or exactly 6 days in advance. In order to be totally sure, he added a second clock. The timer mechanism released a nail that struck a firing cap of a rifle shell. The powder in the shell ignited and detonated the blasting caps. These in turn detonated the explosives. If one failed, there were two more. The bomb was placed into a wooden box which was insulated with a layer of cork from the inside, so the ticking sounds couldn't be heard. Now Elsa went to Munich to install the bomb. If earlier he could manage without much risk, now it was really getting dangerous. He wanted to place the bomb into the pillar nearest to Hitler. He had to make a cavity in a concrete pillar with primitive tools. As the pillar was in a public place, he had to do it during the night and leave no trace. This task was the ultimate definition of grinding. He had to work in constant danger of discovery. In the evening, Elsa hid himself in the Bürgerpojkeller. When the night began, he went to the pillar and began his work. He worked for some hours and then slept until morning. When the cellar was opened, he sneaked out. First, he removed the wooden paneling at the base of the column and added hinges to it, turning it into a secret door. It took him 3 nights. Now the real work began. He had to dig out a cavity in the column for the device. At first, he used a chisel, but the noise was too loud. He then switched to a hand drill. If he had been discovered, a trip to the Gestapo and the death warrant would have been certain, yet he had to return for more than 30 times. Meanwhile, World War II broke out as Hitler invaded Poland. Finally, a week before Hitler's speech, the chamber was ready. Elsa pressed as much explosives in it as he could. He came to install the timing mechanism, but the cellar was unexpectedly locked. He had to return the next day. There was a dance party in the cellar. Elsa attended it, but he was far from dancing. When everyone had left, he began installing the timing mechanism, only to discover that the cavity was too small for it. Elsa sawed off the corners of the mechanism and attended another dance party. During the night, he installed the mechanism into the pillar. It fitted perfectly. He set the clocks in motion. The bomb was to go off in the middle of Hitler's speech. Elsa prepared to escape to Switzerland. He went back to the cellar to check the clocks. They were on time. Next day he left towards the Swiss border. Every
Such
year,
an
he
evil
would
look
sleep
again.
in the Keller for 2 hours. However, this time he needed to be back in Berlin to plan the
Hey,
war, so
Margaret.
he got his speech
Welcome.
shorter and
Cheers.
began it half an hour earlier. On the 8th of November, the Brückenpojkeller was filled with 1,500 old Nazi party members. They greeted Hitler with multiple Sieg Heil! When it was 1 hour and 20 minutes till explosion, Hitler spoke about German
The
defeat
tension.
in World War I, how Germany was betrayed from behind, about the rise of the Nazi party and how it made Germany strong again, how the Western powers have dragged Germany into another war, but now Germany was strong and her enemies were weak. This
Oh,
time
man.
Germany will crush its opponents. The bomb was slowly ticking. Now it was
Yes.
only 20 minutes left. Hitler spoke for some time more and then hurried to the train station. 13 minutes later, the Bürgerpojkeller was rocked with explosion. The pillar was destroyed and part of the ceiling caved in. The hall was filled with smoke and cries of the wounded. 8 people were killed and more than 60 injured.
Oh, shit.
After the chaos settled, the arrests and interrogations began. More than 1,000 people were rounded up by Gestapo. However, they didn't know that they already had the bomber in their custody. Elser had attempted to escape to Switzerland, but he was captured by the guards just 25 meters from the border. Detonator parts had been found in his pocket with a postcard of Bürgerpojkeller. Soon, evidence began to mount against him. He was recognized by many people in Munich, and there was no point in denying. He confessed. However, he was not shot. Hitler wanted his assassins
Что за хуёвое смотрю?
the war. It would have been a good
Эй,
propaganda.
это
Therefore,
отличное.
the would-be assassins were rounded up in concentration camps. When it was clear that the war was lost, all of them
I just
were
noticed my
executed.
chat box,
Among them
like
was
in the
Georg
middle.
Elser. He was killed on the 9th of April 1945, a month before the end of the war.
Это про мужика, который Гитлер хотел убить.
Millions of men, huge arsenals of weapons, lots of time and effort, and a sound strategy. However, this was not the most popular.
Это The Story. Это вот это вот Killing Hitler. Из история Грегор Элсер. Это что мы посмотрели раньше. Сейчас это Brilliant план выиграть Вторую мировую войну, как французы планировали выиграть войну.
Approach. Many pre-war plans involved some manpower, limited material investments, and huge amount of brilliant strategy. Welcome to Brilliant Plans to Win World War II. In these series, we will look at 4 brilliant plans that were supposed to win World War II easily. In the first episode, we will examine the French plan. World War I was a disaster for France. More than 1 million French soldiers had been killed and parts of northern France devastated. However, it would never be repeated. This time, the French General Staff had created a master plan that would have France win the next war with few risks and casualties. Today we will look at their plan and see what went wrong. In the center of the French plan were resources. To fight the modern war, you need loads of them. The main resources were food, iron, coal, and oil. Besides that, there was a wide array of rare materials for building specialized weapons. The French strategy was to deny most of these materials to Germany. It was possible because only coal was found in Germany, and most of other resources Germany had to import. In the beginning of the war, the French and British
Wait, what did they have to get? From oil from Romania. Whatever the fuck this is. I guess this is sulfur from USA. Okay, yeah, that makes sense, I guess. And iron from Sweden.
Germany had to import. In the beginning of the war, the French and British fleets would blockade Germany and stop all shipments of military value. That would deny Germany many food imports and rare materials like rubber and aluminum. Now Germany would only be able to trade overland with European countries. The Soviets had a lot of other resources, but Nazis and communists were enemies, and Soviets would never feed the German war machine. That meant that Germany was to be left without food imports.
What the fuck? Почему Сталин выглядит как царь? Смотри. Как царь чуть-чуть выглядит. Well, окей, это синяя штука. Почему кросс тут? Странно. Все. Anyways, лучше показывать... well. Я покажу вам мир тут. Какой у меня есть. Германская империя очень страшная. Austria-Hungary тут, конечно же, с ними. Болгары, они все тут имеют. Блин. Я спал, когда они весь мир схватили. Это что происходит, когда Россия ничего не делает в мире? Просто спит. Ну, Ireland еще живой. А что они делают? What's Ireland doing? Liberatos, trade deal, opinion factor, special forces. He's eating. Volunteer corps, foreign expeditions, and why we fight. So just basic shit. Like not even interesting. Finland has some interesting stuff. Like what, special forces? Political correctness? No way! Donald Duva has political correctness. People who think correctly are much harder to influence for foreign powers. Oh, maybe that's why we have political correctness in the West. Now that makes sense. Okay. And then indoctrination, of course. Okay. Having established our ideology as based on the truth, it may be thought as truth. Education and media must reflect this lesson. Oh, it may be taught as truth. Having established our ideology as based on truth. Look at that. Смотри, как они написали. нашу идеологию, она как будто построена на правду. Ну, не то, что наша идеология правда, но она построена на правде. Значит, надо учить, как будто это правда. И школы и ТВ-шоу, мультики должны показывать это. Политические комиссары, конечно же, и ecological fanaticism. Я не знаю, что это значит, блин.
The German war machine. That meant that Germany was to be left without food imports. Now there were oil and iron. The major source of oil in Europe was in Romania and iron in Sweden. The British helped out with the oil. They made a deal with the Romanians that they would buy all of the Romanian oil so that none was left for the Germans. Iron ore was excavated from northern Sweden and taken to Germany through the Baltic. However, during the winter the Baltic froze and the shipping was conducted along the Norwegian coast, a route that could be intercepted by Allied navies. So in theory, the iron ore could be denied to Germany during winter. If that didn't work, then Norway could be invaded by the Allies and then Sweden pressured to stop the trade altogether. Germany was well aware of these weaknesses and attempted to produce oil and rubber synthetically and all other materials in peacetime. However, these steps were not enough to sustain a long war. How would these shortages influence the German ability to fight? Without food, Germany had to field a smaller army. Without iron, it could not replace losses and modernize equipment. With oil shortages, the use of tanks, planes, and trucks would be limited and in the end stop altogether. Finally, Germany would run out of food.
Ой, тут написали коммунизм. Где написали коммунизм? Здесь как коммунисты, да, конечно. Политически корректные коммунисты. Кто, кроме коммунистов, придумает политическую корректность? Правду. Это... Политическая правда. Люди, кто думает правильно... Люди, кто думает правильно, намного тяжелее это другим странам что-то сказать. Он выглядит как будто идиот такой.
Meanwhile, France would have all access to these materials and could expand and modernize its army.
Извини, мне очень тяжело читать по-русски. Очень тяжело. Даже если по-английски можете писать, это отлично, если не, постараюсь по-русски почитать. Но намного тяжелее мне по-русски читать. Я не жил в России с 9 лет. 34 сейчас мне, блин. Так что, эй.
By the balance of power would shift in favor of the French, but in the beginning the armies would be rather equal. Would Germany have a chance to defeat France then? The French prepared for this occasion and they created an impregnable defense. Along the Franco-German border, the hilly terrain favored static defenses and hundreds of concrete bunkers and thousands of obstacles were built there. It was believed that the Germans would not be able to come through here and would suffer huge casualties. In the north was Belgium. In the previous war, the Germans invaded France through here and this was not lost to the French. The terrain here was mostly flat and not suitable for fortifications as well as in the south. Therefore, the French decided for another strategy. The Franco-Belgian border would only be lightly fortified, but the best units of the French army were stationed here. If Germany invaded Belgium, they would quickly move forward and dig in along natural barriers, thus creating advanced fortified line. Then if the Germans attacked with full strength and broke through one line, the French would simply retreat to another. By the time the Germans would reach French border, they would have expended so much surprising men that conducting future offensives would be difficult. So France was, or was believed to be, secure from a land invasion. You probably know that France did not do well in World War II. So what went wrong with the French plan? In August 1939, an unexpected and shocking event took place. Stalin and Hitler made a non-aggression pact, according to which Soviets would provide Germany with food, oil and other war materials.
То, что все про нее не понимает никто. Ну, это да, политическая корректность так работает. Я думаю, ты говоришь про политическую корректность, что вранье наговорят, и никто не будет знать, что тебе, когда тебе правда будет говорять настоящую, и ты не будешь знать. Это, конечно. А. Это мне просто пишут, что вот в этом, блин, месте это построили. Танатува. Из всех мест, блин. Да. Да, извини, ужасно тяжело мне читать. Это жалко нету кнопки в Twitch, где могу транслировать на английский. Намного легче было бы. Потому что я honestly, yet even if you translate, you still won't understand. Wait, Mandelstam это кто?
Against France. Due to Soviet help, the French were up against a better supplied Germany than they had anticipated. Yet they were still in a strong position. In fact, it was the Germans who were desperate. They had made a deal with the Soviets, but were they to be trusted? The Soviets could stop supplying Germany any time, and then Germany would be doomed. The Germans had to defeat France now or never. How could they do that? The only way to defeat the French was through surprise. The Belgian battle theater was divided into two areas, the western and eastern. The west was a good terrain for maneuver warfare, and the Allies expected the Germans to attack here. In the east there were the Ardennes hills that had few roads and were generally considered impassable for panzers.
И теперь вот я
Therefore, the French did
транслейтер
not defend
нашел.
well. So the Germans put all on one card and gambled. They decided to risk and make a full panzer assault through the Ardennes. The French believed the Ardennes
Was trying to buy свой пропаганда. А я, это вот это я вижу. Но почему это его называют советский поэт тоже? Это русский советский поэт. Это странно. Like they call him a Russian and Soviet poet. It's like he was strangled by Soviet propaganda. That is a very interesting way to say it. Это очень красивый путь, это вы сказали, это что за советскому пропагандисту и вот так. Hey, привет, Dragos. Welcome. How's it going, Dragos? Cheers. Hello, hello, hello.
To be slow, and only a small force consisting of second-rate troops was put to guard the French defenses on the river Meuse. If they encountered the Germans, they would be reinforced before the main body of German army arrived. However, the assault was carried out by tanks, and their speed managed to overwhelm the defenders before the reinforcements arrived. After the bridgehead was secure, the panzers speeded into French interior. The victory had not yet been
this is
achieved.
awesome.
Now the panzer's spearhead could be easily cut off by French tanks and motorized infantry. But it didn't happen, because the French were gambling too. They didn't anticipate an attack from the south and decided to risk and send their main forces north to prevent the Dutch army from surrendering. Having the Dutch in the fight meant more forces to hold off the Germans in the long term. As the French main forces were in the north, they were unable to react fast enough to the panzer threat in the south.
Oh, they went through Luxembourg.
Panzers reached the sea and cut main allied armies off from supplies. Now the Germans turned towards Paris. It was the time to protect the French capital at all costs, but most of French elite units were stuck in Belgium. The Germans overwhelmed the remaining defenders and entered Paris. The war was lost. Now Germany could secure the resources. During the French campaign, they subdued France and the Low Countries. Thus they also established a land connection to Spain and Portugal. Parallel with the conquest of France, the Germans occupied Norway and secured trade routes to Scandinavian countries. In the east, Germany had made alliances with some countries before the war. In the following year, they invaded Yugoslavia and Greece,
Welcome back, man.
securing
Cheers.
their influence in the Balkans and gained full access to Romanian oil. Now the Germans were much better prepared for a long war. Only some
Welcome back, dude.
thousands of people were killed by 1940. The failure of the French plan meant that the first
I'm
attempt to
watching
make
some
the war
animated,
limited and
stories.
short ended in defeat. That meant that millions of dead would follow. What would you need to bring down the British Empire? A large army, a huge navy, and an air force to match. Well, if you are Nazi Germany, then the things you think you need are mines and submarines. No, not the yellow one. Welcome to the brilliant plans to win
Yeah,
World War II.
the yellow
In
one
these
looks a little
areas,
gay.
we will look how major powers plan to win the war with cunning planning and why they failed.
Well, they're German.
This video looks into the German
They got a
attempt
little
to
weird
blockade
after World War
Britain
II.
into surrendering and features submarines, the Enigma machine, radar technology, and a large amount of oversimplification and reductionism. So, be warned. In theory, the German plan was promising. Britain was getting most of its war materials and food from overseas. If it would be cut off from these supplies, the surrender was imminent. The main strength of the Royal Navy, the battleships, couldn't counter German anti-shipping measures, and the British lacked destroyers which could fill that role. Even more, the Germans didn't need to stop the supplies completely. They
I love
only needed
cartoons,
to sink
dude.
more
You kidding me?
tonnage
I
than the
love
British could build.
cartoons.
This would gradually diminish the amount of supplies until it would cause the collapse of British war effort.
Not even
began the
Anaheim,
Battle of
exactly.
Atlantic,
Cartoons.
during which the Germans would
Okay.
attempt to sink as much Allied merchant ships as possible, and the Allies would do everything in their power to prevent them. Here, the victory would fall to
let
the
me get some
side
more
that
beer.
had better technology. The first
Viva.
German secret weapon was the magnetic mine.
The blood
All
of my
mines
soul.
had to make a physical contact with the ship and were therefore placed near the surface. This allowed them to be swept easily. The magnetic mine, however, stayed on the bottom and reacted to the magnetic field of the passing ship. Due to its depth, it was impossible to locate. The British had developed a magnetic mine of their own, but they needed to learn the inner workings of the German mine in order to counter it. In November 1939, they had a strike of luck. A German plane accidentally dropped a mine on mudflats during low tide. The British took the mine into their base and disassembled it. Having learned its construction, they began degaussing their ships, which meant that the ship's magnetic signature was neutralized and they became undetectable by the mines. They also invented a way to sweep mines by creating an artificial magnetic field between two ships. These measures effectively neutralized the threat from magnetic mines. The main weight of the fighting was relegated to the German submarines. At first, the submarines operated near the coasts of Great Britain, but gradually the British built up their air force and began patrolling the waters. This forced the U-boats to pull back. However, in May 1940, France fell and the Germans established submarine bases on the west coast of France, which allowed them to bypass British air cover and move into the North Atlantic, which wasn't in the range of British planes. There they were confronted with another problem. The Atlantic is very large and the Germans had few submarines. They deployed their U-boats in wolf packs to maximize their efficiency, but in 1941 they could only cover less than 15% of cross-section of the North Atlantic, and many convoys crossed the ocean undetected. But what if the convoys themselves would tell the Germans of their location? The thing was that both the submarines and the convoys
So I
were
do like Anaheim every now and
transmitting their
then, by the
location
way.
to their headquarters via radio, and the messages could be easily intercepted. Therefore, they were heavily encrypted. The Germans broke the British naval cipher early in the war, and this helped them identify the convoy routes. British attempts to update the cipher didn't work, but after they had introduced advanced encoding equipment, they could secure their communications. The Germans weren't able to capture these new encryption
Smart.
devices and couldn't read Allied high-level messages until the end of the war. It
Oh.
could be done the other way too, but the British were unable to read German messages because they used the Enigma machine. With the help of some special operations, they managed to get their hands on some of the German ciphers and encoding equipment, and this allowed them to break the Enigma. By decrypting German messages, they learned about the locations of the wolf packs and diverted the convoys around them. Despite the Germans upgrading their Enigma machine, the British broke it again and continued to read German messages until the end of the war. The battles in the Atlantic continued,
Yeah,
but
that was
by
probably a
summer
problem.
1941, the British managed to stabilize the situation by diverting the convoys and increasing the number of escorts. But when the United States entered
Thank
the war,
God.
the Germans caught them totally unprepared. The submarines moved west and during 1942 sank a large amount of unescorted ships. Eventually the Allies got their act together and enacted the convoy system and established air cover over their waters. This pushed the U-boat operations away from North America. Finally, the western seas became too dangerous, and the submarines moved back to the North Atlantic, which was outside the range of Allied airplanes. Here they continued to achieve success, but by 1943 the Allies had deployed many escorts with improved radio detectors, advanced sonar, and forward-firing depth charges. They became a serious threat to the submarines, and the U-boat successes fell drastically. The Germans developed a new weapon to counter them.
I
The
like how those depth chargers, they're basically catapults. It's like they're just like taking a rock and throwing it. It's like boom. It's like the oldest method, just picking up a rock and throwing it. It's like take that, German.
acoustic torpedo. It would hone in to the sound created by the ship's propeller and neutralize it, rendering it immobile. It was planned to destroy the escort vessels from a safe range and then move against the unprotected merchant ships. This tactic produced good results at first, but soon the Allies countered it by deploying decoys behind the ships that produced far more noise than the ship's propellers, and the German torpedoes were easily diverted. The U-boats were at greatest risk when they were traveling from their bases, which were in the range of Allied aircraft. Modern submarines could have traversed this area underwater, but the U-boats couldn't. They could only operate underwater for limited time using their batteries, but had to periodically recharge them using a diesel engine which needed oxygen. For this, it had to surface. Until now, they had been safely loading their batteries during the night, but now the Allies deployed a new weapon. During the war, the radar went from being big to small, and by 1943 it was being deployed in Allied aircraft. It enabled the aircraft to pinpoint the submarine during the night by radar and engage it using a powerful searchlight and depth charges. This was a major development, and the Germans had two choices. First, they chose to fight back and deployed anti-aircraft guns on submarines. At first this was met with some success, but then the Allies began equipping their aircraft with anti-tank guns and rockets that were able to puncture the submarine's hull in one hit. Fighting back became a hopeless tactic, and submarines resorted to crash diving. The problem was that during the night it was impossible to see the incoming aircraft, and the working diesel engines muted the sound of an approaching plane. When the plane attacked, it was usually too late to dive. To solve this problem, the Germans used the Allies' own weapons against them. They developed equipment that could detect radar waves. Now the submarine could detect an aircraft's radar from a safe distance and dive. However, this proved not to be enough. The British deployed new radar sets which for a time were undetectable by German equipment. They also had deployed an acoustic torpedo of their own. This weapon could be dropped from a plane and then directed itself toward the sound made by the submarine's propeller. So if the torpedo was deployed somewhere near its location, even a submerged submarine could not evade it. This meant that the U-boats had to load their batteries under the water. In order to do this, snorkel was adopted. It was basically a metal tube that allowed the air to move in and out of the submarine.
It took them that long to develop that?
And greatly reduced the submarine's radar signature. However, the old types of U-boats weren't fully suitable for this role, and a new design had to be introduced. The Type 21, also known as the Electroboat. This U-boat embodied the German wartime experience and was a true masterpiece. A snorkel made it possible to be constantly submerged, and a streamlined hull and a larger battery capacity allowed it to travel greater distances underwater. So it only needed to spend 5 hours at snorkel depth to load batteries, and could travel fully submerged and undetectable for 2 to 3 days, and featured many other improvements. This negated many of the advantages the Allies had. So you probably want to know how these
That's kind of too late, wasn't it?
Allied navies. Well, they didn't, because the war ended. The Electroboat idea was born in the end of 1942, and the blueprint was ready by July of the next year. But as the boats had many innovations, getting them into production took time. The first one was ready in May of 1944, and the next year was spent training the crew. The first Type submarine went on its first combat patrol only about 1 week before the war's end, and was unable to get any kills. While the Electroboat was developed, the German submarines continued their operations, but Allied superior technology greatly limited the amount of ships they sank. The German plan to make Britain surrender failed, but how did it contribute to the war? The Axis sank 6,000 ships with a carrying capacity of 21 million tons, amount comparable to the size of British merchant fleet in 1939. But in the meantime, the Allies had built about twice as many new ships. Shipbuilding and extensive anti-submarine measures stretched the Allied resources and may have even helped postpone the Allied invasion of France for a year. The Allies had far greater amount of resources and Germany didn't utilize its meager assets in the best way. This meant that the Allies could just pump out ships on a large scale, and in order to defeat them, the Germans had to have an extremely effective force. But this efficiency was outside their reach. Anti-submarine technology was not difficult to develop, and it could benefit from developments in other fields. The starkest example are perhaps the countermeasures to the German acoustic torpedo Zaunkönig. It was a state-of-the-art technology in its time, and a lot of resources had been spent developing it, but the Allies were able to counter it with a simple decoy made of steel pipes. Meanwhile, the addition of centimetric radar and searchlight forced the Germans to overhaul their whole submarine design that took 2 years to take effect. Therefore, the Germans could never achieve the necessary technological superiority. The German plan didn't work, but it was not the only one to fail. Here you can check out the French plan. If you like the content and want to support the channel, then share, like, and subscribe.
1 second. Let me grab my fried onions.
1941. German army had invaded the Soviet Union. The superiority of the Wehrmacht was clear. Encirclement followed encirclement, with more than 1 million Soviet soldiers becoming prisoners of war. The pre-war Soviet units had been decimated, and by the coming of autumn, Red Army was mostly made up of newly mobilized troops who had not had the time to receive full training. At the same time, the Germans prepared for a knockout punch directed at the Soviet capital. Their armored spearheads had moved forward, but near the gates of Moscow they had exhausted their offensive capabilities. It seemed that the war was decided, and it will end in 1942, with the victory of the Soviet Union. Welcome to the Brilliant Plans to Win World War II. In this series we will examine 4 brilliant plans to win World War II with cunning strategies and see why they failed. This episode is about the Soviet plan to destroy the Army Group Center during the winter of 1941. So why, despite the German successes, would the Red Army win? In autumn 1941, the Germans had calculated that the Red Army was on the brink of collapse and had taken a gamble with their attack on Moscow. However, due to logistical bottlenecks, steady stream of Red Army reinforcements and the coming of the Russian winter, their drive was halted on the approaches to Moscow. Now, German Army Group Center found itself near the Soviet logistical and industrial centers, but at the end of its own supply lines. It was exhausted from months of fighting and with a front line too long to be held with existing troops. The German winter equipment was still in the rear areas, being unable to pass through logistical bottlenecks. And remember, winter was already here. The German troops could not advance, and staying on their present position was too dangerous. So the most sensible solution seemed to pull back and reduce the length of the front and supply lines. However, the Germans lacked the means to transport back all their equipment, and a lot of heavy weapons would have to be left behind, drastically reducing their future capabilities. Even more, the men lacked winter clothing, and a prolonged exposure to the cold during the retreat could have caused large amounts of weather casualties and could have disastrous effect on the morale. 130 years ago, Napoleon had lost his fortune during the retreat from Moscow, and the German army was in danger of doing the same. But what if the Germans would stand and fight? They could overcome their lack of manpower and winter clothing by concentrating their defense in the villages, thus creating a network of strongpoints. In order to successfully attack, the Red Army needed heavy weapons, tactical skill, and air superiority. However, many of the guns lost in summer had still to be replaced. Most of the officers and soldiers had been recently deployed and lacked necessary skills and combat experience, and the Germans still...
I needed a good snack real quick.
Attacking fortified positions would be suicidal with these conditions, let alone in deep snow and freezing temperatures. But the Red Army could adopt a different approach. At the start of the battle, the Soviets did not have a large numerical superiority, but as the time progressed, more and more soldiers were finishing training. The length of the front had left large gaps between the German strongpoints, and the Red Army could move some units into the German rear. Meanwhile, other units would encircle and block off the Germans on the front line. When the exploiting force would reach the vital German logistical infrastructure, it would cause large portions of the German front to be pulled back and be threatened with destruction. Eventually, most of the army group center could be destroyed in this fashion, and then the Germans would not have enough troops to mount a decisive offensive in the summer of 1942. If they couldn't win the war in 1942, then they couldn't do that at all, as later the Red Army would become much stronger and the German supply situation even more serious. In the first half of December, the Soviets put their theory to the test. They counterattacked by moving their forces into the gaps between the advancing German formations. In the south, this
I need to learn this.
of several German divisions. Threatened with being cut off, the Germans fell back. They lacked the time to evacuate all of their equipment, and a lot of it had to be abandoned. The Soviet plan was working, and the Red Army seemed to have a chance to destroy Army Group Center and decide the outcome of the war. For this, the next step was crucial. The Soviets had several options. They could make a stop to resupply their armies, or they could put their forces in one place for a concentrated attack. These steps needed time, and Stalin decided that it was more important not to give the Germans an opportunity to rest and reorganize. Therefore, the attacks were to be continued without resupply, and divisions moved forward without proper ammunition or even sufficient food. In order to help the exhausted armies to advance, all armies on the central part of the Soviet-German front were ordered to attack. The Germans weren't strong everywhere, and inevitably some of the Red Army units would find a weak spot and break through. When the Germans would pull back in order to avoid encirclement, the constant pressure would not allow them to stop the retreat, meanwhile pinning down their reserves in less threatened sectors. The concentration of the German troops was the strongest on the Moscow direction. The Germans decided to pull them back on a shorter position. During the retreat, Soviet forward elements had moved behind the German lines and were now in position to cut off the only major road supplying part of the German Fourth Army. The Soviets chose to pass this opportunity for a bigger encirclement. They directed their forward elements towards Vyazma in order to cut off supplies for both the German 9th and 4th armies. German 4th Army managed to finish the retreat, and the central part of the front solidified. The line was still made up of strongpoints, but there was enough of them to cover most of the roads. Larger Soviet formations were therefore unable to bypass them, and the only way forward was through German strongpoints. The prospect of Soviet attacks here was not promising. Having created a semblance of a solid line in the center, the Germans decided it was time to cling to their positions, and retreat was declared to be not an option. This strategy could work well in the central part of the front, where there were reserves to counter Soviet breakthroughs. But on the flanks, where German troops were sparse, implementing this strategy would probably end up with these units being easily bypassed and encircled. Soviet advance towards Vyazma continued with their forward elements crossing the Moscow-Warsaw highway. The Germans had fortified the villages surrounding the road and used the mobility provided by the highway to sever the Soviet attempts to resupply the forward units. Without them, the Soviet forces in the German rear lacked the capacity to take the key railway hub. Meanwhile, in the north, the Red Army managed to find a gap in the German lines and broke into their rear areas. The Germans did not pull back from their frontline positions, which weakened the supply situation of the Soviet units in the rear, but at the same time allowed them to encircle the frontline units. They could choose between destroying the German 23rd Corps or cutting off the railway, supplying parts of the German 9th Army. They chose to go for the bigger target, but were unable to cut off the railroad due to lack of supplies and German reinforcements. Further north, the German formations were located sparsely, and they attempted to hold their positions in accordance with the Führer's orders. The Red Army advanced, encircling and destroying most of them. In Andreapol and Toropets, they managed to capture large amounts of German food and military stocks and used them to supply their troops, pushing onwards until their units had been spread too thin to continue the advance. After the immediate danger had passed, the Germans regrouped and closed the gap, thus weakening the Soviet supply situation to the point the Soviet units in the German rear were unable to pose a serious threat to German communications. South of Lake Ilmen, the German units managed to avoid destruction and establish an effective circular defense. Nevertheless, the Red Army had cut the land-based communications to 100,000 German troops. Luftwaffe was able to supply these units by air to keep them fighting and prevent them from surrendering. Although the Red Army had attempted some follow-up attacks in the next months, by February the strengths of the Red Army and the Wehrmacht had become even. The German central defenses proved too formidable for the Red Army to infiltrate, and on the flanks where the Soviet units had broken into the German rear, their supply was made inadequate by German strongpoints, and they were unable to seriously threaten the German lines of communications. Both sides had suffered heavily from the fighting and the elements. From the beginning of January till the coming of the spring thaw in April, the Germans had lost more than 300,000 men, a lot of them due to the effects of the weather. The Soviets, who were on the attack and therefore more exposed to the elements, had suffered more than twice the German casualties. With the coming of spring, the Germans had regained their ability to maneuver. They reconnected the encircled troops with the main front line and destroyed the undersupplied Soviet formations in the rear areas, thus solidifying.
Sounds like a lie.
Bases. During the following year, the Soviets attempted to destroy the salient several times, but their efforts did not succeed. It was only after the defeat in Stalingrad that the German troops were forced to abandon the salient. Why did the Soviet plan fail? First, the German command managed to assess the situation correctly and decided not to make a full retreat, but instead took a seemingly more risky approach to stand and fight. This did not allow to inflict heavy damage on the German forces during the retreat. Second, the Soviets thought that the Germans were about to break, and instead of choosing a less rewarding approach by encircling smaller German formations, they took a riskier approach, attempting to destroy all of them in a single deep encirclement, which ultimately failed. This limited the amount of casualties they inflicted on the army group center. Third, although the roads were filled with snow and movement of troops and supplies was slowed down considerably, traveling by air was as fast as ever. German superiority here gave them the final advantage. Luftwaffe was able to interdict Soviet breakthroughs in threatened sectors, keep the encircled troops fighting through air supply missions, and thwart the Soviet attempts to deploy troops behind the German lines through airborne operations. In the next winter, history repeated itself. Germans had once again made significant gains, but when the winter came, they were stopped before their objectives. But by this time, the Soviets had learned their lessons. Instead of attempting to cut off the whole exposed force, they concentrated their assets against a small part of it. After careful preparations, they went on an offensive and cut off the German 6th Army. The Germans attempted to use the proved tactics, forbade retreat, and attempted to set up air supply. However, this time there were too many troops in the pocket, and the dominance of the air was contested. The resupply effort failed, and the German troops were forced to surrender. The winter campaign of 1942 decided the outcome of the war. So technically, the Soviet plan succeeded, but only a year later. If you're interested about other plans to win World War II, you can check them out here. Or if you want to know more about the context of the Soviet plan, you can click here.
Okay.
If you are wondering how the world turned from this into this, then you have come to the right place. Because in this video we are going into this.
Republic. So Canada is not a republic. Oh, well, I guess, yeah, wait, Spain is still a monarchy? Really? I didn't know Spain is still a monarchy. Wait, Scandinavia is a monarchy?
Then you have come to the right place. Because in this video we are going to explain how the age of monarchs came to an end and the age of republics began. So, what is the difference between monarchy and republic, you ask? Well, in monarchy the power is held by one person, and after his death it passes to one of his children. However, in republics the leaders are elected, or at least should be in theory. Although the republics dominate nowadays, the natural system of government historically was the monarchy. Since time immemorial, the people of the earth have been ruled by monarchs. This concept has survived plagues, wars, and mass migrations. Oddities like the Roman Republic were born and then passed into obscurity, and still almost everywhere power was handed over from father to son. Monarchies dominated well into the 18th century, but in the last 200 years everything changed. By now, only 44 countries out of 200 have monarchs in their head, and 16 of them are part of the British Commonwealth. How did the world make such a rapid transition? Well, let me introduce the three gravediggers of the monarchies: the Enlightenment, World War I, and colonialism. Now we'll dive into history and look why most of the countries became republics. Note that in order to keep things simple, we will only take into account when a country finally stopped being a monarchy. So no swinging between kings, republics, and emperors, France. We also don't take into account how much actual power the monarchs have. It's just about the title. The downfall of monarchs began in the late 18th century with the spread of the philosophy of enlightenment. One of its main ideas was that the republic is superior to monarchy. It was impossible to try these new ideas out in practice in Europe because monarchies were entrenched there, but it could be done in the Americas. The New World was colonized by European monarchies. However, in the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, most of the colonies declared independence. Then a question arose. How should these new countries be governed? As most of the New World elites were of European origin and influenced by the Enlightenment, they decided to try out this republic thing. And so most of the newly independent colonies became republics. Some decided to go with an upgraded version of the monarchy. Therefore, there were no pesky kings in the New World, only emperors. Mexico started out as an empire, but was soon transformed into a republic. The French attempt to restore the empire didn't do much good. The Brazilian empire lasted longer, but it was also eventually overthrown. Now let's look at the Caribbean. Here the Europeans held out for longer. The first independent nation in the Caribbean was the Haitian Empire, which was created by revolting slaves. It was eventually replaced by a republic. Next, the Spanish colonists declared independence
What
as
empire?
republics. The rest of Caribbean islands didn't have large populations, and European powers managed to keep control over them. The British gave their colonies independence and released most of them, with Queen Elizabeth remaining as their head of state. However, these countries decided to become republics within the Commonwealth. Other island nations remained under the control of foreign powers. If you wonder, then the colonies got their independence in this order. The Caribbean Commonwealth nations and Canada are the only countries led by a monarch in the New World. By the middle of the 19th century, there were only two republics in Europe, Switzerland and the tiny country of San Marino that styles itself as the oldest republic in Europe. All other countries were monarchies, but many of them had republican factions that waited for things to go sour in order to seize the power and proclaim a republic. Out of all the nations, France had the largest problem with its identity. It struggled to choose between the republic, empire and kingdom. The defeat of the Second French Empire by the Germans discredited the monarchy and allowed the republicans to seize power. Portugal was humiliated and bullied by great powers, and local republicans directed the popular discontent towards the monarchy. They were so successful, they managed to overthrow the king and proclaim a republic. Other monarchies were doing pretty well, but soon World War I began, and it was the bane of the European kings and emperors. The war began with enthusiasm, but soon its absurdity and pointlessness became more and more apparent. The people felt that the old elites and monarchs had dragged them into this war, and ideas of socialism, democracy and republicanism began to spread. It was believed that the old political systems were to blame for the war, and if the people would get rid of them, then there would never be another large war in Europe. Soon, these ideas could be put into practice. The monarchs of the defeated great powers of Russia, Austria, Germany and the Ottoman Empire were overthrown by their subjects. The countries that emerged after the dissolution of these powers became republics too, except Hungary.
At the end, the one thing that kept mass war from happening is technological advancement and the people's ability to kill each other, increasing to such levels where it was like, yeah, let's just not do this.
It was on the defeated side of the war and was stripped of much of its territories. This led to a communist revolution which was followed by a monarchist restoration. But as Hungary couldn't find a suitable monarch, it became a kingdom without a king. Not the last case in the European history. During the next large war on the continent, Eastern Europe became part of the communist bloc. The communists did their thing and abolished the monarchies in their sphere of influence. In Italy and Greece, the monarchies were abolished because of their support to authoritarian governments. The King of Spain took notice and instead played an important role in restoring the Spanish democracy. He could keep the throne. Iceland, Ireland, Cyprus and Malta got their independence and became republics. Finally, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and Republic of Czechoslovakia were dissolved. All of the new states became republics. That's a lot of information for one video, isn't it?
The Soviet Republic were USSR, United Socialist Soviet Republics. Jesus Christ.
Soon.
They're still republics.
The great Emperor of China, Shah of Persia, Pharaoh of Egypt are all gone now. And this video shows you exactly how this happened. It is about the abolition of monarchies in Asia, Oceania and Africa. We'll begin our story with North Asia. Here we don't have a lot of explaining to do because most of the lands were conquered by China and Russia. Russia became the Soviet Union and then was dissolved into the constituent republics. China has had dynastic cycles throughout its history. One dynasty would reign for some centuries and then be replaced by another, and so on. 19th century China was ruled by a foreign and an increasingly unpopular dynasty, and it was clear that the time for a dynasty swap was coming soon. In 1912, the native Chinese finally seized power, but instead of proclaiming a new emperor, they declared a republic. The last traces of monarchy were erased when communists took over mainland China 4 decades later. Oh, here are 2 Chinas, and the other is a republic also, although this one had not been enlightened by Karl Marx's bestseller. Japan modernized successfully and fended off the Europeans, so its emperor survived. It then annexed Korea and abolished their monarchy. When Korea got its independence as 2 countries, they both became republics. Although North Korea does not really seem to be a republic, as here the power has been handed over from father to son. Mongolia was originally part of China, but during the Russian Civil War, a white Russian warlord invaded Mongolia and created his state there. He was then deposed by the Soviet Red Army. Instead of giving Mongolia back to China, a communist Mongolian People's Republic was set up. That was quite simple. However, this is not the case with Southern Asia and the Pacific Islands. Most of the islands here were colonized by the Europeans, but a few territories were able to keep their independence. Usually it was because they were so remote that Europeans didn't bother to administer them directly, with one exception, Thailand. Thailand was a large nation, and the great powers were interested in controlling it. However, due to its strategic location between the British and the French colonies, they couldn't decide who could keep it. So it stayed free. All other lands were colonized by the Europeans. Many societies in the South Pacific didn't have long traditions of centralized rule, and strong kingship didn't develop there. So when they got independence, there weren't any real kings to claim the throne. Most of them became republics. If there were no kings in the East, then in the West there were way too many of them. Here there had been many kingdoms prior to colonization, and many of the monarchs had retained their titles.
Oh, they
The
should have
new
borrowed
countries the
some. Europeans should have
their
borrowed some
colonies
kings
were
from
far
there,
larger
since they
than
had so
previous
many.
kingdoms. They had a lot of monarchs within their borders, so none of them had any real legitimacy to rule the country as a whole. Also, power structure. While colonizing, the Europeans established a colonial administration, and local monarchs were placed under it. When the countries got their independence, then this system didn't disappear. Instead, it was taken over by the locals, and the monarchs were still left in a subordinate position. Therefore, even if they wanted to take over the country, they didn't have the necessary power to seize power. These new states became republics, except Malaysia. Here the local kings could work together, and they established a federation with one of them in its head. The other exception is the French Indochina, which was not released as a unitary country, and here the concentration of kings was not too large for establishing a monarchy. In these countries the monarchy survived the colonial era. However, it was not to last. In some countries the monarchy was later abolished by constitutional means, and in others by violence. Only in Cambodia was monarchy later reinstated. So only these countries have kept their monarchs up until the present day. In addition, there are some nations led by the British Queen. Now the Middle East. Here many countries retained their independence, and the remaining region was carved up between Britain and France. The French spread republicanism to their colonies, but the British had puppet kings to govern them. People did not trust these kings due to their collaboration with the British, and most of them were deposed sometime into independence. To the south of these nations is the Arabian Peninsula. The great powers weren't interested in it, as there wasn't much more than sand there, and they confined themselves with controlling the territories loosely, leaving the local monarchs in charge. Later, though, oil was discovered there, and after becoming independent, the rulers here became very rich. They used their newfound wealth to suppress discontent, and kept not only their thrones, but also much of their power. Other monarchs in this region were not so lucky. The Afghan monarchy fell victim to political infighting. Iran was transformed by an Islamic revolution, and in Yemen, the communists seized power. Last, we look at Africa. Most of the pre-colonial Africa consisted of monarchies, except Liberia, which was founded under American influence and was therefore a republic. Other parts of the continent stayed under the power of small kingdoms and chiefdoms. Then the Europeans came, colonized the continent, and then granted independence to their colonies. On average, the new nations were rather large, and the situation resembled the one in South Asia. Too many kings in one nation individually lacking legitimacy and power to rule the country as a whole. But there were two exceptions: small countries and big kingdoms. We'll start with the latter. Before colonization, Africa had some big kingdoms. Some of them were destroyed by Europeans, others made deals with the Europeans, and when their countries were given independence, their dynasty was back in charge. There were also some small independent countries that were small enough to be ruled by a single ruler. The Europeans conquered West Africa early, and kingship didn't survive here. However, it did in the East. In these countries, the kingship survived the colonial era. During independence,
I'm thinking maybe I should
monarchy was
make some
abolished in many
coffee for
states.
myself.
However, one man sought to reverse this trend. The dictator of Central African Republic proclaimed himself as the Emperor of Central Africa. However, he instantly became a laughingstock, and his reign as the emperor lasted only 3 years. So there are only 3 monarchies left in Africa. A quick conclusion. In the New World, all countries that are not in the British Commonwealth are republics. In Europe, all countries are monarchies, except those that were ruled by communists, became republics in the aftermath of World War I, newly independent island nations, nations where monarchy was abolished for other reasons, and Switzerland and San Marino. In Asia, monarchies are the countries which had strong traditions of centralized rule, weren't ruled by communists, except Cambodia, aren't large post-colonial countries except Malaysia, and where monarchy was not abolished during the independence, and that aren't special cases. Plus the nations that are headed by the British Queen. In Africa, monarchies are the countries that are not large post-colonial nations, which were made up of many small kingdoms, countries where monarchy was not suppressed by Europeans and where monarchy was not abolished during their independence. This was the tale of the demise of the monarchies. Now, if a question should pop up why some country is a kingdom and other is not, then you should probably know the backstory. Estonia, a country on the intersection of Eastern and Northern Europe, bordering the Baltic Sea with a population of over 1 million people, and Oscar. So, how did all these people get here? I mean, when and how did their ancestors arrive in Estonia thousands of years ago? A decade ago it would be impossible to tell, but now thanks to developments in science we can give some insight into the genetic history of ethnic Estonians. Hello, I am Oscar. Before we get started with my ancestors, we'll find out how the study of genetics can help us study history. First of all, we need to talk about how babies are made. Children's genes are the random combination of their parents' DNA. Therefore, a child can never be exactly like either of its parents. However, a part of DNA always remains unchanged in the transfer. The Y chromosome is transferred unchanged from father to son, and the mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively from the mother. So you, your mother and grandmother share the same mitochondrial DNA, and so on. The same goes for men and the Y chromosome. These parts of DNA don't change with reproduction, but over time they accumulate several mutations. Because the Y chromosome has more mutations, it is easier to study it. From here on out, we'll focus on the Y DNA. If you compare the Y DNAs of 2 men, you can find out who was their first common forefather. If there is enough data, you could even estimate where he lived. It has been established that 90% of Estonians have patrilineally descended from one of these 5 men who lived more than 20,000 years ago. These men are important because they were the founders of great tribes. Scientists have given them these classifications, but in order to make the story easier to follow, we made up our own names for these guys. Their successors didn't come to Estonia at the same time. They arrived at different times for different reasons. And now we'll take a closer look at how their successors made it to Estonia. Our story begins at the end of the last ice age. Northern Europe was under a shield of ice, and a big part of the continent was covered with uninhabited tundra. People had fled to the southern parts of Europe and to the Middle East, where they had to endure a cold climate for millennia. That's when Aitor, Dagda and Aras were born. Aitor was born on the Balkan Peninsula, Dagda and Aras in the mid-Eurasia. The latter two shared a common forefather and originated from the same tribe, but they went on to found their own separate tribes. The descendants of these men were the first to reach Estonia. How did it happen? At one point, the climate started to warm up and the ice began to recede. Now, suddenly in front of them, the hunters-gatherers found an uninhabited land with plentiful game, and they started migrating north. The ice receded from Estonia 11,000 years ago,
Perfect.
and people settled in soon after that. Were the first human inhabitants in Estonia the descendants of Aitor, Aras or Dagda, or did they come from another tribe? We can't be sure. We do know, however, that Aitor's descendants were in the Baltics at least 6,500 years ago, Dagda's descendants 7,500 years ago, and Aras's descendants at least 6,000 years ago. It took a long time before a new wave of migration hit Estonia. These migrants were also the descendants of Aras. However, they were very different from the ones who had already lived in this region. What happened to them in the meantime? The thing is, not all the descendants of Dagda and Aras went north at the beginning. Some of them had settled to the Pontic steppe and became later known as the Indo-Europeans. There they domesticated horses, started using bronze tools and began cultivating land. These innovations gave the Indo-Europeans great advantages, and 5,000 to 6,000 years ago they started expanding rapidly and their population began to thrive. As a result, their descendants are the most numerous among present-day Europeans. Their language was the foundation to most of the modern European languages. Dagda's descendants moved for the most part to Western Europe, and Aras's descendants, among other places, populated Eastern Europe and reached Estonia a little less than 5,000 years ago. With them, they brought agriculture. This gave them a great advantage against the local hunters and gatherers, because it enabled them to gain more food from the same area. Aras's descendants multiplied rapidly, and they began to form the bulk of the Estonian inhabitants. Finally, even the hunters-gatherers started cultivating land. The fourth forefather of Estonians, Kalev, was born in the Far East about 15,500 years ago. Later, his descendants migrated west and north. Some of them settled down in the southern region of the Ural Mountains. There,
What is that
a man
map?
was born to the Kalev lineage.
Oh, this is Russia. Okay.
As he was one of the great-grandsons of Kalev, we shall call him the son of Kalev, or Kalevipoeg in Estonian. His tribe gained a strong footing of its own and started spreading out. The descendants of Kalevipoeg populated a large part of northern Eurasia. Today his descendants populate the lands from Chukotka to Norway. Some of them migrated west and settled down at the
Wow.
eastern shore of the Baltic Sea. As people in the regions where Kalev
So what was the point of that? I mean, why go so far away? Like, why this giant chunk in the middle? Like, are they like, yeah, we're family, but let's just never talk or see each other ever again.
Kalevipoeg's descendants live, speak Finno-Ugric languages, it is believed that Kalevipoeg was a Finno-Ugrian. This means that the modern Estonian language developed from a language that Kalevipoeg once spoke. The exact time of Kalevipoeg's descendants' migration hasn't been determined, and scientists are still working on it. It's still unknown what gave the Kalevipoeg tribe the edge that enabled them to spread so widely. If you happen to be of
Can move my
Estonian
ears.
ancestry, then you could help the scientists out with solving these problems. More about that at the end of the video. Ragnar, the fifth forefather of Estonians, was probably born in Central Europe 5,000 years ago. His tribe had been living in Europe at least since the end of the Ice Age. Ragnar's descendants were driven away to Scandinavia by other tribes, which at the time was populated by hunters-gatherers. As Ragnar's descendants were agriculturists, they multiplied rapidly and became dominant in Scandinavia. Later on, Scandinavians started by...
This dude just throwing fish in the ground. It's like trying to plant fish. Ragnar is smart. He's planting seeds, but these guys are just planting fish. Maybe if we try hard enough, the fish will grow trees.
rapidly and became dominant in Scandinavia.
Hey,
Later
fertilizer,
on,
I guess.
Scandinavians started
Hey,
dispersing,
here's
and
that.
thus a large number of Ragnar's descendants ended up in Estonia. Aitor and Dagda were here first, but the subsequent migrations reduced their numbers significantly. As a result, only 3% of Estonians are the direct descendants of Aitor, and 9% the descendants of Dagda. The number of Aras's descendants was boosted by agriculture, which is the reason 33% of Estonians descend from him. Kalev's tribe was the last to reach Estonia, and his direct descendants make up at least 31% of ethnic Estonians. And due to a major influx of Ragnar's descendants, there are around 15% of them among Estonians. However, according to Family Tree DNA's Estonia project, the numbers are as follows. If you want to find out more about how the descendants of these men have reached here, then here are some brief rundowns. You can pause the video and read them. So, this was a review on the Estonian genealogy. The research is still going on and the given picture is a simplified one. We'll learn a lot more about the Estonian ancestry in the coming years. But now, back to Oscar. Which of these men is his forefather? Oscar took the test and found out that he is the direct descendant of Aras. He also found out about his ancestors' journey to Estonia. His forefathers traveled from the forest steppes to Central Europe and then moved to Scandinavia. From there, his tribe spread out to various places across Northern Europe. Among them was Oscar's forefather who came to Estonia. The DNA test can be ordered by anyone, and there are actually at least 3 reasons you might want to do it. First, you will find out which tribe you descend from, and secondly, what might have been your ancestors' migration path to Estonia. Thirdly, we do not know yet when did Kalevipoeg's descendants arrive to Estonia. Scientists are still working on it, and you can also help them by having your ancestral origin determined. Every bit of new information can get us closer to the answer. Right now, there are not many Estonians who have done the test, and so we only know where our ancestors lived thousands of years ago. But the more people determine their ancestry, the better and closer we'll be able to examine the journey of our ancestors. For example, right now, Oscar doesn't know yet when did his forefathers travel from Scandinavia to Estonia, but with your help, he might find out one day. So, whose tribe do you belong to? Are you a direct descendant of one of these men,
I'm so
or do you
sleepy.
belong
I'm so
to some
sorry,
other,
guys.
much rarer lineage? If you want answers to these questions, then you should consider participating
Maybe
in the genetic
I'll stream
research.
tomorrow.
You can find out more about the research from a link down below.
Maybe I should stream tomorrow. Cause, god damn, like I just keep yawning over and over again. It's awful. But first, maybe let's watch this.
Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important updates are coming from the course direction, where according to information we have, the Ukrainians managed to enter the village of Koreniva and to establish control over first buildings and the streets, and most likely the Ukrainians managed to reach the river and to cut this territory, this city, already in two. What do we have from this direction? Let's discuss in details. This video was published by the Russians. This is the first video that was published by the Russians from the Koreniva direction. And in this video we can see the movement of Ukrainian personnel carrier that was destroyed as a result of Russian fire. So the Ukrainians were sending personnel carriers to evacuate wounded soldiers. At least this was stated by the author of this video. And 2 vehicles were destroyed. And all these things took place exactly in this area. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map just along this part, let's say to the west of Matveyevka and inside of the Olgovka itself. But later, right before we start making this video, we got additional update from the group of forces north. In this video, we can see the movement of Ukrainian convoy. Let's try to count the number of vehicles that are moving in this video. There is 1 vehicle, the 2nd vehicle, the 3rd vehicle, and 4th. 4th vehicles were heading from the Koreniva itself towards the mainland, and this let's say convoy got ambushed by the Russians and was destroyed. This video confirms that Ukrainians do have their positions inside of the city of Koreniva. It's very difficult to understand whether the Ukrainians were ambushed or they were destroyed as a result of let's say anti-tank missile strike, or the Russians using the distance mining method mined the main street and the Ukrainians basically entered the minefield and were destroyed. Very difficult to understand, but despite the fact that we still don't know how exactly they were destroyed, we have enough of information to adjust the map and to add additional control to Ukrainian territory. Furthermore, just to remind you that during the previous few days we got a lot of updates from Olgovka itself. In this video we can see the Ukrainian tank that entered the village itself, and that Ukrainian tank was attacking the Russian forces but was destroyed as a result of FPV drone strike or as a result of Lancet strike. So we have enough of updates. We've received a lot of updates for the previous few days to adjust the map in Ukrainian favor. So summarizing everything, the eastern part of Koreniova most likely under complete Ukrainian control. Matveevka, Olgovka are under Ukrainian control as well. Now let's move a little bit the forces, Ukrainian forces closer to the line of combat contact. Now let's talk about Glushkovka area. We have a lot of very interesting updates, and the most important is that the Russians continue building pontoon bridges. And during the previous few days, the Russians built significant number of pontoon bridges around Glushkovka. The Russians are trying to secure the area and just to stay on the safe side. One of the bridges was built here, was discovered here, another one was discovered here. Most likely there are much more, let's say, bridges in this area, pontoon bridges. The Ukrainians are trying to attack them and to destroy them, but something tells me that the Russians may stop building the bridges because they still haven't managed to stabilize the situation. Let's call it in the eastern flank of Glushkovka. What we are talking about? According to different mappers, the Ukrainians continue offensive operation in the western direction. As a result of clashes during the previous few days, the Ukrainians established complete control over the village of Snagast and over the village of Vishnyovo. The Ukrainians managed to establish complete control over the village of Apanasovka, and the Ukrainians captured the village of Blyachova. This information was confirmed by different mappers. We haven't received geolocations that can confirm this. The only video we have took place in Vishnyovka, and most of the mappers consider this video as the Russian artillery strike on Ukrainian positions. But if we take a look at this video, I can't tell for sure that this is the Russians who were bombing the Ukrainian positions. Maybe these Ukrainians who were bombing the Russian positions. So anyway, most of the mappers use this video, let's say, to confirm Ukrainian progress, but we are not for 100% sure that this is exactly what was happening in the village of Vishnyovka. So what is the most important? The Russians were building the pontoon bridges behind Zvanne, Glushkovka, Kobylki, because they were expecting that Ukrainians would attack the Russians, let's say, from the area of Tyotkina, that the Ukrainians would attack the Russians, so from the south. And from this perspective, to have pontoon bridges is a very good idea. But if the Ukrainians are planning to move from the east to the west, in this case, the pontoon bridges, we can say, plays not a very good role, and they are not bringing additional benefits for the Russians, because in this case the Ukrainians may capture all these pontoon bridges and they will have access to move further in direction of Rylsk. So very difficult and very complicated situation is taking place in Glushkova area. The Ukrainians are advancing. Now we start receiving updates about the fall, about the beginning of the fall of Koreniova. So let's see what the Russians are planning to do, but obviously the situation is very difficult. Now let's talk about the eastern flank, about the villages of Martinovka. Today we got additional updates from pro-Ukrainian mappers, and according to information we have, the Ukrainians established complete control over the village of Martinovka. Yet we haven't received any geolocations that can confirm this, but most likely this is exactly what happened in this city during the previous 24 hours. Furthermore, we got additional update that Ukrainians moved further in the eastern direction and captured the village of Cherkaska Konopelka. Currently, the Russians are trying to create additional defense belt and to slow down the Ukrainians on the line Biryukova, Pushkarnaya, Ulanek. So this is the next defense belt without significant fortifications, just with the concentration of forces, where the Russians will try to stop the Ukrainians and not to allow them to move further in the eastern direction. The Ukrainian offensive operation slowed down, obviously we can see this, but they continue moving, which is most important. Now let's move to Kharkiv direction. The different mappers confirmed additional progress of the armed force of Russian Federation in Liptsi, and the sources reported that the Ukrainians began redeployment of forces of fresh and free forces from the Kursk direction towards Kharkiv, with the purpose to slow down the Russian offensive in Liptsi, and the Ukrainians continue redeployment of their forces to Kupin's direction to the river Oskol with the purpose to slow down the Russian offensive operation in the vicinity of Sinkovo, where, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Now let's move further. Let's talk about
This is quite something, not gonna lie.
We continue receiving updates about the Russian progress in the vicinity of the railway station Vyemka. Different mappers continue updating and improving their maps, showing additional Russian progress from the first side. But on the other hand, some different mappers stated that the Russians haven't managed to improve their positions further in the northern direction in Ivano-Darivka, and that the Russians were forced to fall back to the south towards more reliable positions. So the positions of armored forces of Ukraine to the north of Ivano-Darivka are located on the hill. The Russians made a lot of attempts to capture this territory.
That's how tired I might be.
And were repelled by the Ukrainians, and the Russians decided to fall back. So this is the situation, and most likely the Ukrainians would restore control over Ivano-Darivka in the very near future. Now let's talk about the Toretsk agglomeration, where the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. During the previous 12 hours, we got additional video from the city of Druzhba, and in this video that was published by the Armored Forces of Ukraine by the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, we can see a serious number of FPV drone attacks and FPV drone strikes on the Russian edge positions, and some episodes of this video were geolocated. One of the episodes was geolocated in this point, the second one here. Based on this video and based on these geolocations, we have adjusted the map, and most likely during the upcoming day most of the mappers will do the same. So as you can see, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly, and now the Russians control more than 60% of the city of Druzhba, and most likely this city will fall within the next few days, maybe within 2 or 3 weeks. The same additional progress was spotted in the Toretsk itself. So today we can make a conclusion that since the beginning of the battle for Toretsk, for the first time of the battle for the Toretsk agglomeration, the Toretsk itself, the Russians managed to capture the first buildings and the first streets of the city of Toretsk, because according to the borders of the city, this small part of these buildings and these streets are the part of the city of Toretsk, and the Russians captured the first, let's say, part of this territory. Very important progress. We see that the Russians have answered this territory from 3 sides, from Zalizne, from Nilipovka, and from Druzhba. There are very heavy clashes right now, and let's wait what is going to be next. Pro-Ukrainian mappers Deep State confirms that the Ukrainians abandoned their positions completely in the industrial zone of the New York agglomeration, and which confirms that, if you remember yesterday we were talking, either the Ukrainians would try to withdraw their positions this upcoming night, or they would appear in a cauldron. So as you can see, the Ukrainians decided to fall back from this area. So we are expecting the additional report from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. We are not expecting this report today, but most likely maybe tomorrow or the day after, the Russians will announce the complete control over the city of New York. Now let's talk about the Pokrovsk direction, and according to information we have, the forces of 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine lost their combat capabilities as a result of clashes with the Russians. You know that it's around a year past since the beginning of clashes with this 47th Brigade. The first videos and the first appearance of this brigade took place during the battle for Avdiivka. They were responsible for the area between Krasnogorovka, Stepovoy, and Berdichi, and as you can see, almost a year passed.
My eyes just keep closing. I hate this.
And now, somewhere in the vicinity of Grodovka, this brigade lost their combat capabilities completely. The Ukrainians are removing them for restoring.
Maybe I started my stream too late.
Now let's talk about Novogrodovka. It's already 3rd or 4th day in a row about when we haven't received anything about clashes on the terracons or inside of the city. The Russians were stopped along the wall of the terracons. Now the Russians trying to think what to do next. Different mappers continue updating their maps, including the pro-Ukrainian one, but most of these updates are about the improving of their positions along the line without significant improvement deep inside of the territory of Ukraine. Some neutral mappers confirmed additional progress of the Russians in the vicinity of the landfill of Russia, and most likely this is going to be the first Terikon, the first landfill the Russians will try to assault and to capture. The Russians need at least one landfill to get some strategical aid, and from this position they will be able to control the situation around. Without one hill, without at least one hill, the Russians' chances to move further in the western direction very fast are very low. According to information we have and according to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the vicinity of Karlovka. Basically, the Ukrainians, due to the risk of being encircled, withdrew their positions towards the western part of Karlovka, and the territory between Yasnobrodovka itself and the water reservoir was captured by the Russians. Now let's move to the Konstantinovka agglomeration, and today we got additional
What's going on there?
from the sources. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the eastern part of the village and to capture the streets of Miru, Shakhtarska, Jerelne streets and so on. So as you can see, significant progress, and currently the Russians control around 30% of Konstantinovka and around 60-70% of the eastern part of this small village. Very important progress. The battle is about to move to the western part of the village, and after that we can start counting days. And now
the entire front collapses.
Reports,
yes.
From Kiev we have interesting reports and interesting updates. According to information we have, Germany will stop support Ukraine.
Yes.
And but according to information we have, by the end of the year, the Ukrainians will continue receiving additional help from the loan that was given to Ukraine by the Germany authorities. And we have report that Denmark authorized Ukraine to use their weapon to attack the territory of Russian Federation. And when talking about weapon, we remember that Denmark is one of the countries that are going or have already sent Ukraine the F-16. So basically they allowed the Ukrainians to use F-16s to attack the territory of Russian Federation. Very difficult to understand when exactly the Ukrainians are going to use. They begin going to use these aircrafts, but most likely very soon. And that's it for the video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel. Put your likes.
Interesting. Interesting. What is this? Like, whoever makes these stupid thumbnails is like, goddamn. Fuck. What is this?
All interrogations included a common set of questions, and if someone slipped and said something different from one time to the next, the Russians became suspicious and accused him of lying. Then they would really bear down on him to find out what he was hiding. They caught many people that way, and it was horrible for those who got caught. Those who were trying to hide something, those who said something dumb, those whose unit caught the Russians' attention, or those who they thought might become an agent for them, were interrogated more frequently than the rest of us. The interrogators were all NKVD agents.
Well, this is
all
interesting.
except Colonel Stem wore Russian army uniforms, but with different coloured hats. Once, when I was being interrogated by another interrogator, the interpreter was a pretty young woman lieutenant. At one point, the interrogator left me alone with her. I had just said I had been in Italy, and while the interrogator was gone, she told me that she had been in Italy also. We talked about Italy, and she asked if I knew the Italian song Parla mi d'amore, Speak to me of love, and she sang a few words of it.
If anyone was interested, I'll post a link.
We talked very cordially for several minutes, but when the interrogator returned, she became sober and businesslike again.
'Cause I don't think I'll watch the entire thing of that. But I do like listening to some Eastern Front stories. Every now and then, see if there's anything new. Escape the liberal West. Russia opens doors. Russia opens its doors to families with traditional values. Oh, how nice. That actually might play out real well for Russia.
The
No
Spanish
joke.
were busy exploring. Hey, 42 here. In the year 1519, the Aztecs ruled one of the largest and most powerful empires
And this is
on
this
planet
video.
Earth. Home to some 6 million people and spanning more than 800,000 square miles of Mesoamerica. The Aztecs were a dominant military force with a rich culture and a proud history. The empire's capital, Tenochtitlan, was amongst the 3 largest cities on Earth, and its emperor, Moctezuma II, was a wise and intelligent leader. But fast forward just 2.5 years, and somehow, this most mighty of empires had been utterly defeated. The sheer speed of this demise is nothing short of stunning. But even more remarkable is how that demise came about. Because the great and powerful Aztecs weren't toppled by a vast invading army or obliterated in an apocalypse-class natural disaster. No. They were completely and utterly defeated by just 500 men. And not just any men. Their conquerors were a ragtag...
You know, I'm gonna come back to this tomorrow. I gotta come back to this tomorrow. Yeah. Like, I'm way too tired. I'm sorry, guys.